In 1996, a 35-year-old construction worker in West Virginia named David got a prescription from his doctor. He had hurt his back on the job. Nothing unusual about that. The prescription was for a new painkiller. His doctor told him it was safe, non-addictive, revolutionary. The pill was called OxyContin. Within 6 months, David couldn't leave his house without it. Within 2 years, he had lost his job, his marriage, and his savings, trying to buy more pills. Within 5 years, he was dead. But here's what nobody told David. The company that made OxyContin, a family-owned pharmaceutical company called Purdue Pharma, already knew their drug was dangerously addictive. Their own scientists had told them. Their own internal memos confirmed it, and they sold it anyway. They didn't just sell it, they spent $40 million in 1 year alone marketing it directly to doctors. They trained their sales representatives to lie. They bribed physicians with vacations, speaking fees, and cash payments to prescribe it to as many patients as possible. Over the next 25 years, more than 500,000 Americans would die from opioid overdoses. 500,000 people, more than the entire American death toll of World War II. And the family that started it all? They walked away with $11 billion. Not a single member of the Sackler family went to prison. Not one. This is the story of the greatest drug scandal in American history. The story of how one family, with the help of corrupt regulators, bribed doctors, and a broken legal system, created an epidemic, and then bought their way out of it. To understand how the opioid crisis happened, you need to understand one family, the Sacklers. In 1952, 3 brothers, Arthur, Mortimer, and Raymond Sackler, bought a small, struggling pharmaceutical company in New York called Purdue Frederick. Arthur was the eldest. He was brilliant, charming, and ruthless. He had a medical degree from NYU, but what he was really good at wasn't medicine, it was marketing. In the 1950s and 60s, pharmaceutical companies didn't advertise directly to doctors. That wasn't done. Arthur Sackler changed that. He essentially invented modern pharmaceutical marketing. He bought a medical advertising agency. He started placing ads in medical journals, making drugs look more effective than the evidence showed. He paid doctors to give lectures promoting specific medications. He understood something nobody else in the industry had fully grasped yet. Doctors are humans, and humans respond to incentives. Give a doctor enough free meals, free trips, and professional recognition for prescribing your drug, and they will prescribe your drug. It sounds obvious now, but in 1955, this was revolutionary and deeply unethical. Arthur's most famous early success was Valium. He marketed it so aggressively that by 1978, Valium became the first drug in history to sell 100 million prescriptions in a single year. It was called Mother's Little Helper. It was later discovered to be highly addictive. A pattern was forming. Arthur Sackler died in 1987, before OxyContin existed, but the playbook he created? His brothers and their children would take it to a scale that Arthur could never have imagined. By the late 1980s, Purdue Pharma, now run by Raymond's son Richard Sackler, was looking for their next big product. They had been working on a formulation of OxyContin, a powerful opioid painkiller. Opioids had existed for centuries: morphine, heroin, codeine. The medical community had always treated them with extreme caution. They were reserved for cancer patients and the terminally ill, because everyone knew opioids were addictive, powerfully, devastatingly addictive. But Purdue Pharma had an idea. What if they could convince doctors and the FDA that their new opioid was different? What if they could reframe addiction as someone else's problem? In 1995, Purdue Pharma submitted OxyContin to the FDA for approval. The FDA assigned the medical officer named Curtis Wright to review it. He approved it with an extraordinary label. The label claimed that OxyContin's time-release formula meant it was less addictive than other opioids. There was almost no clinical evidence supporting this claim, and within 2 years of approving OxyContin, Curtis Wright left the FDA. He took a job at Purdue Pharma, with a salary of nearly $400,000. The pill was cleared. The regulator was captured. Now came the sales force. In 1996, Purdue Pharma launched OxyContin with the most aggressive pharmaceutical marketing campaign America had ever seen. They hired an army of sales representatives, over 600 of them. Each one was assigned the territory. Each one was given a quota, and each one was given a script carefully crafted to neutralize doctors' fears about addiction. The pitch went like this: "Doctor, your patients are suffering unnecessarily. Pain is undertreated in this country. OxyContin is a breakthrough, a controlled-release formula that delivers steady, non-addictive pain relief. Less than 1% of patients develop addiction." That last line, less than 1%, where did that number come from? From a single paragraph, a letter written by a doctor in 1980 in the New England Journal of Medicine. It studied hospitalized patients given opioids. It wasn't a clinical trial. It wasn't peer-reviewed research. It was 101 words about hospitalized patients who were closely monitored and then discharged. Purdue Pharma's sales force cited it as definitive scientific proof to hundreds of thousands of doctors across America. And it worked. Between 1996 and 2001, Purdue spent over $200 million marketing OxyContin. Sales went from $48 million in 1996 to $1.1 billion in 2000. They were growing by 2,000% in 4 years. But it wasn't just advertising. Purdue had created an entire ecosystem of influence. They identified the highest prescribing doctors in every region, calling them high decile prescribers. These doctors received the most attention from sales reps, the most gifts, the most speaking fees, and cash payments to prescribe it to as many patients as possible. They created a program called Partners Against Pain, a patient advocacy group, supposedly independent, that promoted aggressive opioid prescribing. It was funded entirely by Purdue Pharma. They sponsored medical conferences. They funded pain management advocacy groups that lobbied state medical boards to remove restrictions on opioid prescribing. They even created a coupon program, free first prescriptions of OxyContin. Get the patient started at no cost. Make sure they come back. And they did come back, because the drug was working exactly as their own internal scientists had warned it would. Here is something Purdue Pharma knew and hid. The time-release mechanism that was supposed to make OxyContin safe, it failed for a significant portion of patients. The drug released too quickly, creating a surge of euphoria, exactly the kind of rush that triggers addiction pathways in the brain. They knew this. Sales representatives in the field were reporting it. Patients were calling pharmacies asking to refill prescriptions weeks early. Doctors were seeing patients change, becoming dependent, desperate, escalating their doses. In internal emails, Richard Sackler, the grandson who was now president of Purdue Pharma, received these reports. In one email, a company researcher warned of widespread addiction. Richard Sackler's response, captured in court documents, was essentially this: blame the patients. His exact words, discovered in a lawsuit, were this: "We have to hammer on the abusers in every way possible. Not the drug, the people dying from the drug." Meanwhile, the prescriptions kept climbing, and in the small towns of West Virginia, Kentucky, Ohio, and Maine, something terrible was beginning. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, small towns across America started changing. Places like Huntington, West Virginia, population 46,000, coal country, hardworking, close-knit communities where a back injury at the mine was not unusual, where doctors trusted the drug company's promises, where a prescription for OxyContin seemed like a compassionate solution to real suffering. By 2001, something was wrong. Pharmacies were reporting unusual patterns, people coming in with multiple prescriptions, refilling too early, driving long distances, sometimes hundreds of miles, to see different doctors in different counties. What became known as pill mills were emerging. Pain clinics where doctors, some genuinely corrupt, some just naive, prescribed OxyContin to anyone who could pay. Cash only. No insurance needed. No real examination. Just a quick conversation, a prescription pad, and a handshake. In some clinics in Florida, a single doctor was prescribing more OxyContin than entire hospitals. Patients were selling their pills on the street. A single 80 milligram OxyContin tablet, which cost $4 at a pharmacy with insurance, was selling for $80 on the street. Communities that had never had a drug problem in their history were disintegrating. And then came the next wave. Purdue Pharma, under growing scrutiny, reformulated OxyContin in 2010 to make it harder to crush and snort. They thought this would solve the problem. It didn't. It made it catastrophically worse, because by 2010, millions of Americans were physically dependent on opioids. Their bodies needed the drug to function. When OxyContin became harder to abuse, they needed a cheaper, stronger alternative. They found it: heroin. Heroin dealers flooded into communities that had been saturated with prescription opioids. The pipeline was already there. The customers were already addicted. And heroin was cheaper than pills. From 2010 onward, overdose deaths accelerated. But it wasn't just heroin. By 2013, Mexican cartels and Chinese chemical manufacturers had developed something far deadlier: fentanyl, a synthetic opioid 50 to 100 times more powerful than morphine, cheap to make, easy to conceal, deadly in microscopic quantities. A dose the size of a few grains of salt could kill an adult. It began contaminating the drug supply. People who thought they were buying heroin were getting fentanyl. People who thought they were buying counterfeit pain pills were getting fentanyl. They had no idea until they stopped breathing. 500,000. That number is hard to imagine, so let's make it smaller. Think about the largest stadium in your city. Now, fill it completely. Now imagine everyone inside dying of a drug overdose. Now, do that 5 times. That is what the opioid crisis has taken from America since 1999. And the family that started it, the Purdue Pharma family, were through most of this period hosting galas at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Their names were on museum wings, on university buildings, at the Louvre in Paris, at the Guggenheim in New York. Philanthropists, respected, untouchable. By 2007, the evidence against Purdue Pharma was overwhelming. Federal prosecutors in Virginia had been building a case for years. They had internal documents, they had emails, they had testimony from former sales representatives who described being trained to minimize addiction risks to doctors. They had proof that Purdue knew and concealed that OxyContin was being widely abused. In 2007, Purdue Pharma pleaded guilty to federal criminal charges of misbranding OxyContin. They paid a fine of $600 million. 3 executives, not the Sacklers themselves, but hired managers, pleaded guilty to misdemeanor charges. No prison time. $600 million sounds enormous, but consider this. By 2007, Purdue Pharma had made over $3 billion from OxyContin alone. The fine was essentially a cost of doing business, a rounding error, and they kept selling OxyContin. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary examples of legal maneuvering in American history. As lawsuits began piling up from states, cities, counties, and tens of thousands of individual families, the Sackler family began moving money. Billions of dollars transferred out of Purdue Pharma, into private accounts, into shell companies, into overseas holdings. From 2008 to 2018, the Sackler family extracted approximately $10.7 billion from Purdue Pharma, while the company was being investigated, while it was facing thousands of lawsuits, while Americans were dying by the hundreds of thousands. The money was being moved to safety. In 2019, Purdue Pharma filed for bankruptcy. The lawsuits had become impossible to fight individually. Bankruptcy allowed them to consolidate everything into one legal process and negotiate a single settlement. The number they eventually agreed to? $6 billion, from a family that had extracted $10.7 billion. The Sacklers would pay $6 billion over time, and in exchange receive legal immunity from future civil suits related to the opioid crisis. Every state, every county, every family that had lost someone, barred from ever suing the Sacklers again. And still, not a single member of the Sackler family faced criminal charges. In September 2021, a federal judge rejected the initial settlement. He ruled that the bankruptcy court couldn't grant immunity to the Sacklers, who had not themselves filed for bankruptcy, from third-party lawsuits. It was a rare moment of judicial resistance. The case wound through appeals courts for years. In 2024, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled on the matter. In a 5-4 decision, one of the closest possible margins, they allowed a modified version of the deal to proceed. The Sacklers would pay. They would receive broad legal protections. Justice Neil Gorsuch, writing for the majority, said the settlement allowed for maximum compensation. Justice Sonia Sotomayor, in dissent, wrote something that cut to the heart of it. The Sackler family will pay billions of dollars, but will never have to face a civil jury. That is not justice. Let that sit for a moment. 500,000 people dead, a family worth billions, and not one of them will ever sit in a prison cell. It would be easy to make this story only about the Sacklers. They were the architects, but they couldn't have done it alone. The FDA approved OxyContin based on insufficient evidence, and the man who approved it took a job at Purdue. Congress, lobbied heavily by the pharmaceutical industry, passed laws that made it nearly impossible for the DEA to cut off the supply of opioids to suspicious pharmacies. The DEA's own internal investigations into suspicious pill distribution were shut down multiple times by supervisors with ties to the industry. Pain management advocacy groups funded by pharmaceutical companies successfully lobbied medical boards across America to treat undertreated pain as a public health crisis, creating the perfect environment for aggressive opioid prescribing. Insurance companies covered OxyContin readily, while making it difficult for addicted patients to access the medications that treat addiction. This was not a failure of one company. This was a system working exactly as it was designed to work. Designed to protect capital, designed to protect reputation, designed to protect the people with the most money and the most lawyers. David, the construction worker from West Virginia, the man I told you about at the beginning of this story. He had a son. His son grew up watching his father disappear, watching him become someone else, watching the pills change him. His son's name is Tyler. Tyler is 28 years old now. He has spent years advocating for opioid victims' families. When the Supreme Court announced its ruling in 2024, Tyler said this: "They get to keep the money, they get to keep their freedom, and my dad is still dead." $500,000 Americans wiped out by a pill that was designed to create the very addiction it claimed to treat, by a family that knew, by regulators who looked away, by a legal system that found a way to let the guilty pay a fraction of what they took and walk free. The opioid crisis is not over. Fentanyl is still flooding across borders. Americans are still dying at a rate of more than 80,000 per year. The Sackler name is slowly being removed from museum walls, but the Sackler fortune remains. And the playbook, the Arthur Sackler playbook of buying influence, corrupting regulators, and marketing dangerous drugs as safe breakthroughs, that playbook still exists. It is being used right now on new drugs, on new patients, and on new families who don't yet know what's coming. The only question is, who's watching?